Moonraker had successfully broken the bounds of what has been expected or seen in a Bond film. Eon had decided that after that film there was no way to go bigger or more outlandish than outer space, though Die Another Day creators would beg to differ. So there was only one place for Bond to go, both literally and figuratively: back to Earth. To achieve this convincingly, the film For Your Eyes Only went back to Fleming, along with an emphasis on a Cold War espionage action thriller, and less on gimmicks and gadgets, which is symbolically represented by the destruction of Bond's gadget-filled Lotus and the use of the more humble Citroën in the film. This film follows James Bond's attempt to recover an ATAC transmitter, a device that could control the firing of the missiles of the British fleet before the Russians do. This is against the backdrop of a revenge plot in which Melina Havelock, the main Bond girl, seeks to avenge her parents who were killed investigating the ATAC plot. Since Roger Moore's contract had expired, the very first scene featuring Bond leaving flowers on Tracy's grave was intended to be the introduction to a new Bond actor, Timothy Dalton being one of the actors under consideration, but Moore had renewed his contract. This was actually taken from the On Her Majesty's Secret Service novel, where Bond visits the grave of Casino Royale's Vesper Lynd. This is followed by Bond's final conflict with Blofeld, who, in this case, is played by Lando's assistant from The Empire Strikes Back, and is voiced by the same actor who dubbed Largo in Thunderball. Bond hanging from a helicopter that's under Blofeld's control is suspenseful and does its job. But after Bond gains control of the helicopter, the scene takes on a slightly comedic tone, where Blofeld is begging for his life only to be patted on the head by Bond. There's also this bizarre line: "I'll buy you a delicatessen in stainless steel!" Overall, this pre-title sequence is incongruous in both the tone and narrative with the rest of the film. In the end, it was just Eon's way of saying "screw you" to Kevin McClory, who had just earned the rights to make his own version of Thunderball, and denied Eon the rights to use the Blofeld character. While generally disappointing, I was just happy to see Bond finally put an end to Blofeld, and although his character was handled with very little dignity in this scene, it was worlds better than how he was handled in Diamonds. Despite this mixed bag of the pre-title sequence, the film feels like a return to form of the early Connery era, partly characterized by the return of writer Richard Maibaum. It's based around a Fleming plot, is not so liberal with its use of gadgets, and it illustrates a personal conflict within Bond as he tries to convince Melina not to take revenge for fear that she'll end up a killer like him.
The Chinese have a saying: before setting out on revenge, you first dig 2 graves.
To further enhance this feeling of going back to the basics, some elements of the early films appear. For example, the scene with Moneypenny features Moneypenny hitting on Bond again. As for the last 4 films, she had come off as more of an old friend than a potential lover. They even include Bond's hat trick again. Additionally, Bond has an ally, Milos Colombo, who is similar to Karim Bey and Mark-Ange Draco. Like those two, he runs an under-the-table organization with strong connections, and he adds some charisma to the story. His best scene is with Bond, where he judges whether or not he should kill him.
You may need this. I'm a good judge of men. Mr. Bond, you have what the Greeks call thrasos, guts.
So have you, Mr. Colombo.
He was also instrumental in one of the key plot twists of the film, where at first it seems like he's going to be the main villain of the film, but it turns out Bond's ally, Christatos, was actually behind the theft of the ATAC. And this plot twist is taken directly from Ian Fleming. In fact, a great deal of the plot is taken from his short stories and novels. Most of the short stories were the ones featured in the For Your Eyes Only collection, but 2 are used in their entirety to develop the plot. First, the For Your Eyes Only short story develops the aforementioned revenge theme with Melina Havelock and her attack on the Cuban hitman who killed her parents. To the detriment of the story, one of the better elements is left out of the film. In the short story, M's friendship with the Havelocks causes him to call on Bond to eliminate the Cuban hitman as a personal favor. All the time he is conflicted by the use of his position for something personal. Unfortunately, because of Bernard Lee's untimely death, this film becomes the only film to date to not have M. As for the character of Melina Havelock, I think on her own she's a good character addition to the film. She has a strong backstory, a personal philosophy, and she's definitely able to take care of herself. But I don't think she's that strong of a Bond girl. This isn't her fault though. She is attractive and plays her part well, but she has virtually no chemistry with Roger Moore. I attribute this mostly to his age, which they kind of poke fun at in Bond scenes with BB.
He thinks I'm still a virgin.
Yes, well, you get your clothes on, and I'll buy you an ice cream.
While I'd say his performance has improved as the film progressed, Moore's age had never been that apparent until this film, and it appears the difference with Carol Bouquet's age was a bit too large. Cassandra Harris, however, who played Liesel, worked better as the Bond girl in this film. She was certainly closer in age, and they did have a good rapport.
Smugglers? How would I know any smugglers?
Well, I would have thought that a lady in your position would get to know many things. I'd really be most grateful.
How grateful?
Very.
I adore grateful men.
An interesting note about the actress, she was then future Bond Pierce Brosnan's wife, and it was she who introduced him to producer Albert Broccoli. The character she portrayed was the Bond girl of the other important short story Risico, which featured the plot twist with Christados and Columbo and leads to what I'd say is the best scene in the film, Bond's killing of the henchman Locke. Bond has Locke cornered on a cliff and he takes the time to remind him of a likable ally of his, Ferrara, who Locke killed earlier in the film.
You left this with Ferrara, I believe.
Roger Moore was actually hesitant to do this scene, citing it to be too cruel for his Bond. I think his disgust actually helps the scene, as Bond dislikes the prospect of killing in cold blood. In the short story, this was the villain Christatos. Aris Christatos is played by the bad guy from the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Julian Glover, who had once auditioned to play Bond. The word that I think describes him as the villain is unmemorable. Though I think this is partly due to the fact that the film was hiding that he was the villain, even after he is revealed, he just comes off as weak. Many, if not all, the Bond villains have a particular scene that makes them more evil. Frequently, this is characterized by them killing a henchman who failed them, or killing a Bond girl we'd grown to like, but in this case we're given two weak lines. One is during the decent keel-hauling torture sequence of Bond and Melina from the Live and Let Die novel. One of his henchmen accidentally falls in the water and is attacked by sharks, and Christados just says, leave him. The fact that it wasn't him doing the job makes him seem like a coward. Another scene is near the end, where he threatens to kill BB's trainer Brink because she turned BB against him. Simply put, nothing much comes of it. I guess this all goes along with the fact that Christados really isn't the mastermind behind the theft of the ATAC. General Gogol from the previous two films is. The climactic scene of the film, which is interestingly not Christatos' death, but is the confrontation between Bond and Gogol, which features Gogol forcing Bond at gunpoint to hand over the ATAC. Rather than let the Russians take it, Bond destroys it, citing détente as the reason. As Gogol supports this idea, something that will come into play in the next movie, he lets Bond live. What I find interesting about this is that Bond essentially failed his mission to recover the ATAC.
Your mission was a success.
Oh, be quiet. This dated scene is probably the biggest weakness of the film. A comedian imitating Margaret Thatcher is randomly included to congratulate James Bond, but the whole time she is speaking to Melina's parrot. This is certainly a scene that should have been left on the cutting room floor. And so we're left with a decent Bond film, which, while using the great elements that made fans love the originals, it doesn't quite reach the higher echelon of classic. It is, however, one of my favorites because it masterfully combines elements of the Fleming literature with a brilliant use of locales and good supporting cast, while including some cool spy elements, using steam to reveal a secret message, using pistachios to detect approaching henchmen, and using a shoelace to climb up a rope in the suspenseful climbing sequence. Its comparative poor performance among Bond fans I attribute to a lackluster villain and a script that could have been streamlined with the removal of the Blofeld scene, the Thatcher scene, the submarine fight, and Bond's fight with the killer hockey team.
It's the hockey team from hell!
But I'd say these elements can be easily overlooked, and they don't deprive me of what I'd say is an enjoyable cinematic experience.